The diner had been loud all morning, plates clattering, coffee pouring, truckers arguing over football. But when the door opened and a disabled Navy SEAL stepped inside on crutches with a military K9, the room went strangely quiet. He looked around the packed diner for a place to sit. One table after another suddenly became reserved. One man even pulled his chair closer to the table like the veteran might steal it. The SEAL didn't argue. He just nodded politely and kept moving. Until he stopped beside the counter where a young waitress named Olivia was pouring coffee. "Ma'am, would it be all right if I sat here?" Before she could answer, the K9 beside him suddenly locked up like a statue, staring directly at Olivia. And what the dog did next made the entire diner realize this waitress wasn't just a waitress. If stories about quiet heroes and unexpected moments of respect mean something to you, take a second to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because the moment you're about to hear about started in a place so ordinary that nobody inside that diner realized they were about to witness something they would talk about for years. The diner had been loud all morning. Plates clattered against tables, coffee mugs slid across the counter, and the low hum of conversations bounced off the old tiled walls. Truckers argued about football scores. A couple of construction workers laughed loudly near the window. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee hung thick in the air like it always did during the breakfast rush. Behind the counter, Olivia moved quickly between customers with the calm rhythm of someone who had been doing this job long enough to read a room without looking directly at anyone. She poured coffee, wiped down the counter, and scribbled orders onto a small notepad clipped to her apron. To most people in that diner, she was just another tired waitress in her early 30s trying to survive another shift. But if someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the way she moved with unusual precision. Her posture was straight even after hours on her feet. Her eyes constantly scanned the room in quick, quiet glances. And when a glass slipped from a customer's hand near the end booth, Olivia turned toward the sound before anyone else even realized it had fallen. Small things. The kind of things most people would never notice. But they were there. Olivia didn't talk much while she worked. She kept conversations short and polite, the way people do when they carry thoughts they don't want to share with strangers. The diner owner liked her because she was reliable. Customers liked her because she was calm even when the place was packed. But none of them knew why loud noises sometimes made her pause for half a second before continuing. None of them noticed the thin scar running along the inside of her wrist that disappeared under the edge of her sleeve. And none of them knew that every morning before work, she sat in her car in the parking lot for a few minutes, staring at the steering wheel like she was preparing herself to step into a world that had once been very different. For Olivia, this diner wasn't just a job. It was a quiet place where nobody asked questions. A place where she could move through the day without anyone knowing the parts of her life she had worked very hard to leave behind. The door chime rang sometime around 8:30, but nobody paid much attention at first. The diner door opened dozens of times during a morning rush. Another customer meant another order of eggs, another cup of coffee, another voice joining the background noise of the room. But something about this entrance slowly changed the atmosphere inside the diner. Conversations didn't stop exactly. They simply softened. A few heads turned toward the doorway, then a few more. The man standing there looked like someone who had spent a long time outdoors. His face was weathered beyond his years, his dark jacket worn but clean. One hand gripped a metal crutch supporting his weight. His other hand rested on the harness of a large German shepherd standing calmly at his side. The dog's vest carried a small patch identifying it as a trained military service K9. But what most people noticed first wasn't the dog. It was the neatly folded pant leg pinned just above the man's knee. The disabled Navy SEAL stepped inside slowly, giving his eyes a moment to adjust to the dim light of the diner. The dog walked beside him with quiet discipline, every movement controlled and deliberate. For a few seconds, the man simply looked around the room like any traveler searching for a place to sit. The diner was nearly full. Most of the booths were occupied, but there were still empty seats scattered across different tables. Plenty of space for someone to join a group for breakfast. The veteran moved toward the first open booth where two middle-aged men were finishing their coffee. His voice was calm and respectful when he spoke. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, resting lightly on the crutch. The two men exchanged a glance that lasted barely a second. One of them cleared his throat and shook his head. "Sorry," he said quickly. "We're waiting for someone." They weren't. Their plates were nearly empty, and they were already reaching for their jackets. But the veteran simply nodded once like he understood the message and moved on. At the next table, a young couple avoided eye contact before he could even ask. The man slid closer to the center of the booth, pretending to scroll through his phone. At another table, a family with 2 children suddenly decided they needed more space. The mother offered a polite smile that carried just enough discomfort to make it clear the answer was no. The veteran never argued. He never raised his voice. Each time he was turned away, he simply nodded again and shifted his weight on the crutch before moving to the next table. But something about the pattern was beginning to spread quietly through the diner. People were watching now, watching a man who had clearly sacrificed something for his country politely ask for a place to sit, while every table found a reason not to make room. Even the dog seemed to notice the tension building around them. The K9 stayed perfectly calm, its sharp eyes moving slowly across the room, as if studying each person who looked away. Behind the counter, Olivia had seen the entire thing unfold without saying a word. She watched the veteran move from table to table. She noticed the way his shoulders stayed relaxed even when people refused him. She noticed the careful way he balanced his weight so the crutch barely made a sound on the floor. And she noticed something else most people in the diner didn't. The dog wasn't just any service animal. The way it walked, the way it held its posture, the way it kept its attention on the man beside it. Those were signs of specialized training. Military training. Olivia felt a strange tension pull at the back of her mind, the same instinctive awareness that sometimes surfaced when she saw certain details other people ignored. For a moment, she looked down at the coffee pot in her hand, debating something quietly with herself. Then she did something that seemed very small, but would change everything about that morning. "Sir," she called gently from behind the counter. The veteran turned toward her voice. Olivia slid the empty stool beside the counter outward with one hand and gave a small nod. "You can sit here if you'd like." For the first time since walking into the diner, the veteran's guarded expression softened slightly. He moved toward the counter carefully, positioning the crutch against the side of the stool before lowering himself onto the seat. The German shepherd settled beside him without needing a command. For a moment, the diner returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations slowly restarted. Plates clattered again. Someone laughed near the window. Olivia poured a cup of coffee and placed it in front of the veteran like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. But just as she turned to refill another customer's mug, something unexpected happened. The K9 suddenly froze, not barking, not growling, just completely still. Its ears lifted sharply as its eyes locked directly onto Olivia. Then the dog slowly stood up and walked toward her. The entire diner began to notice the silence spreading again as the trained military K9 stopped in front of the waitress, sat perfectly upright, and stared at her like it had just recognized someone it hadn't seen in years. The disabled SEAL watched the scene unfold, confusion slowly replacing the calm expression on his face, because military K9s only reacted like that for one reason. And as the dog remained perfectly still in front of Olivia, the veteran leaned forward slightly and asked a quiet question that made her heart skip a beat. "Ma'am, have we met before?" For a moment, Olivia didn't answer. The question hung in the air between them while the German shepherd remained perfectly still at her feet, its posture rigid and attentive. Around them, the diner had gone unusually quiet again. Customers who had been whispering or pretending not to watch were now openly staring at the strange scene unfolding near the counter. Olivia forced herself to keep moving, reaching for the coffee pot like nothing unusual had happened. She poured another cup for a customer 2 stools down, wiped the counter with a small towel, and tried to ignore the weight of the dog's gaze fixed on her. But when she finally looked back toward the veteran, she noticed something that made her chest tighten slightly. He wasn't watching the dog. He was watching her, carefully, like someone trained to read people the same way other men read maps. "I don't think so," Olivia replied quietly, her voice calm but controlled. She gave a small shrug as if the moment meant nothing. I've worked here a long time, though. Maybe you passed through before. It was a reasonable answer. Ordinary. But the veteran didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the way she moved as she reached for a stack of plates beside the register. Her posture was balanced, her steps deliberate. Even the way she turned her shoulders slightly to keep an eye on the entire room looked practiced. The dog hadn't moved either. The German Shepherd sat with its ears forward and eyes locked on Olivia like it was waiting for instructions that had never been given. The veteran leaned down slightly, placing a calm hand on the animal's harness. "Rex," he said softly. The command was subtle, the kind of quiet signal a trained handler uses to reset a dog's focus. But Rex didn't look away. The canine simply stayed seated in front of Olivia like it had already decided something important. Olivia pretended not to notice. She grabbed a small notepad and asked the veteran what he wanted for breakfast, keeping her voice steady as she wrote down the order. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, simple food. The kind of meal someone chooses when they aren't trying to draw attention. As she walked toward the kitchen window to place the order, she felt the dog shift slightly behind her. Not aggressive, not threatening, just following with its eyes the same way a soldier tracks movement across unfamiliar terrain. Something about that attention made a quiet tension settle in the pit of her stomach. It had been years since anyone, or anything, looked at her that way. Years since someone studied her like they were trying to recognize a ghost they weren't sure was real. When she returned to the counter a few minutes later, the veteran was still watching her carefully. Not rude, not suspicious. Just curious in a way that suggested the pieces of a puzzle were slowly fitting together in his mind. "You said you've worked here a long time," he said after a moment, stirring his coffee slowly. "Must be a busy place during the mornings." His voice carried the casual tone of small talk, but the question felt oddly deliberate. Olivia nodded. "Most days," she replied. "Truckers, construction crews, regulars, same people every week." She wiped down a clean section of counter, even though it didn't need it. The veteran nodded thoughtfully, glancing briefly at the K9 before returning his attention to her. "You ever work anywhere else?" he asked. Olivia paused for half a second before answering. It was such a small hesitation most people in the diner wouldn't have noticed it, but the veteran did. "Not really," she said. "Just here." The response was quick. Too quick. Rex shifted again, the dog's tail brushing lightly against the floor while its eyes remained fixed on Olivia like it was still waiting for something. The veteran leaned back slightly on the stool, letting out a slow breath through his nose. Something about this interaction was beginning to feel familiar in a way he couldn't explain yet. The kitchen bell rang as the cook slid the veteran's breakfast onto the counter. Olivia placed the plate in front of him, but the moment she leaned forward to set it down, the K9 suddenly stood up again. Not aggressive, just alert. The dog stepped closer, lowering its head slightly as if inspecting something only it could sense. Several customers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man near the window even pulled his chair back an inch, unsure whether the dog might suddenly bark or lunge, but Rex didn't do any of that. Instead, the German Shepherd simply sat again beside Olivia's leg, its posture straight and disciplined like a soldier waiting for orders. The veteran watched the behavior closely now. Rex had spent years trained to recognize certain scents and movements, combat environments, explosives, injured soldiers, even specific types of military gear. The dog had seen dozens of civilians since leaving active service. Never once had it reacted like this. "You ever work around military bases?" the veteran asked casually between bites of eggs. Olivia shook her head without looking up. "No," she replied, but her voice carried a small strain now that hadn't been there earlier. The veteran noticed that too. He didn't push the question further right away. Instead, he glanced around the diner briefly, watching how the customers who had refused him earlier were now pretending to mind their own business again. Some looked embarrassed. Others just looked curious. But everyone was listening. Even the diner owner behind the register had stopped counting bills and was watching the exchange quietly. The veteran turned back toward Olivia, lowering his voice slightly so the conversation felt more private. "Rex doesn't usually do this," he said. "He's trained to stay focused on me unless he recognizes something." Olivia forced a small smile. "Maybe he just likes coffee," she said lightly. But even as she spoke, the dog's eyes never left her face. The veteran finished half his breakfast before speaking again. "You know," he said slowly, "Rex spent a lot of time with combat medics overseas. They smell a little different to dogs like him. Medical kits, antiseptics, gun oil, that sort of thing. Military canines learn those scents early." Olivia's hand tightened slightly around the coffee pot she was holding, just enough for the handle to creak softly against her grip. She quickly set the pot down and wiped the counter again, even though it was already clean. "I think you're reading too much into it," she said calmly. But the veteran didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached down to scratch behind the canine's ear, the way handlers do when they're thinking through something important. Rex didn't move from Olivia's side. The dog simply remained there, quietly attentive, as if the answer it was waiting for was standing right in front of it. The diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm again, but the tension near the counter remained. A few minutes passed without anyone speaking. Olivia refilled a couple of coffee cups and carried plates to another booth while the veteran finished his meal. When she returned, he was examining something with quiet focus. Not the dog this time. Her wrist. The thin scar she usually kept hidden beneath the edge of her sleeve had slipped into view while she carried the plates. The veteran's eyes lingered there for just a second before he looked back up at her face. It was a small scar, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. But to someone who had spent years around combat medics, it looked very familiar. The kind of mark left by a field tourniquet tightened quickly under fire. He set his fork down slowly. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice quieter now. "You sure you never served?" Olivia didn't answer right away. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier somehow. Rex gently placed his head against her knee like he was comforting someone who didn't want to admit they needed it. Several customers near the counter exchanged uneasy glances as the silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Finally, Olivia stepped back slightly, forcing a calm expression onto her face, even though her heart was beating faster now. "You should finish your breakfast," she said softly. But the veteran was no longer looking at the plate in front of him. He was looking directly at her. Because the way the K9 was reacting, the scar on her wrist, and the way she avoided that last question were starting to tell him a story he hadn't expected to find inside a quiet roadside diner. And for the first time since he walked through that door, the disabled SEAL realized something that made the back of his neck prickle with recognition. The woman standing in front of him wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had seen war. Before we go further, if you've ever learned the hard way that you should never judge someone by their job or appearance, comment "never judge" below. Because the next thing this veteran was about to say would force Olivia to confront a past she had spent years trying to forget. And the moment he spoke the next words, the entire diner was about to learn exactly who she used to be. For several seconds after the veteran spoke, Olivia didn't move. The sounds of the diner, plates clinking, chairs shifting, someone laughing near the window, seemed to fade into the background like distant noise. Her eyes remained fixed on the counter, while Rex rested his head lightly against her knee, the trained military dog unusually gentle for an animal built to detect danger. The veteran watched her carefully now, the calm patience of someone who had learned that sometimes the truth only appears when you give it room. He wasn't accusing her of anything. His voice had carried no pressure, but the question had landed exactly where he knew it would, because scars like the one on Olivia's wrist didn't come from ordinary jobs. They came from chaos, from moments where someone had tightened a tourniquet fast enough to stop a soldier from bleeding out. And as the seconds stretched on, he noticed something else. Olivia wasn't denying it anymore. She finally exhaled slowly and stepped back from the counter, crossing her arms as if she suddenly felt cold. "You should eat before it gets cold," she said quietly, but the words sounded distracted, almost automatic. The veteran didn't look at the plate. Instead, he rested both hands on the edge of the counter and leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice enough that the rest of the diner could only hear fragments of the conversation. "I spent 12 years around combat medics," he said calmly, "and I've seen that scar before." Olivia's jaw tightened slightly. She glanced around the diner quickly, noticing the curious looks drifting in their direction. The truckers near the window were pretending to watch the television mounted on the wall, but their attention kept sliding back toward the counter. Even the cook had slowed down behind the kitchen window. Olivia reached down and gently nudged Rex's head away from her leg before stepping toward the end of the counter where fewer customers could hear them. "You're mistaken," she said quietly, but there was less confidence in the words now. The veteran studied her expression carefully. "Maybe," he replied. "But Rex doesn't usually mistake people." As if responding to his name, the German Shepherd stood again and moved closer to Olivia, sitting beside her like he had already decided she belonged under his watch. The veteran gave a small shake of his head, half amused and half puzzled by the dog's behavior. "He worked with medics overseas," he explained. "After certain missions, he wouldn't leave their side. Dogs remember things most people don't." Olivia swallowed and looked down at the floor for a moment. Something in the veteran's calm tone had made it impossible to brush the conversation away the way she usually did when people got too curious. The veteran finally broke the silence. "Afghanistan?" he asked quietly. Olivia froze. It wasn't the word itself that caught her off guard. It was the certainty in his voice. She slowly looked up at him again, studying his face the way he had studied hers earlier. There was something familiar in the man's eyes now that she hadn't noticed when he first walked in. Not recognition exactly, more like shared memory, the kind of look people carried when they had both survived the same storm. "You're guessing," she said softly, but the words sounded weaker now. The veteran gave a small shrug. "Maybe," he said again. "But the way you reacted when I mentioned Kandahar earlier, that wasn't a guess." Olivia looked away quickly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. The name of that place still carried a weight she had never managed to shake. It had been years, but some memories didn't fade with time. The veteran leaned back slightly, letting the moment breathe again. "You don't have to explain anything," he said after a moment. "I'm just trying to understand why my K9 thinks he knows you." Rex shifted closer again, resting against Olivia's leg with quiet loyalty. She glanced down at the dog and felt something stir in her chest she hadn't felt in a long time. Comfort, familiarity, the kind of steady presence that had once followed her across dusty desert roads and inside makeshift medical tents where wounded soldiers arrived faster than anyone could treat them. Olivia closed her eyes briefly, letting out a slow breath before speaking again. "I wasn't a soldier," she said quietly. "I wasn't even supposed to be near the front lines." The veteran didn't interrupt. He simply listened. "I was a combat medic," she continued, her voice almost distant now, "attached to a SEAL unit for emergency response." The words seemed to surprise even the people who were only catching pieces of the conversation. The truckers by the window had stopped pretending not to listen. A few heads turned openly now. Olivia didn't seem to notice. Her attention remained fixed somewhere far beyond the diner walls. "We responded when things went wrong," she explained quietly. "When someone got hit, when things got messy." The veteran nodded slowly. "Call sign?" he asked gently. Olivia hesitated. "Angel 6. The veteran's expression changed instantly, not dramatically, just enough that someone watching closely would notice the shift. He leaned forward slightly, studying her face again as if confirming something that had suddenly clicked into place. "Angel 6, he repeated under his breath. The name stirred a memory buried deep in the years of operations he'd survived. A medic who had pulled wounded operators out of situations that should have killed them. A medic who had stayed behind during one of the worst ambushes his unit had ever faced. The veteran slowly exhaled through his nose. "I heard that call sign once," he said quietly. Olivia's eyes flickered with surprise. Only once. She looked at him carefully now, searching his face the way someone searches a map for a landmark they recognize. Where? She asked. The veteran rested one hand on Rex's harness and met her gaze directly. Kandahar, he said. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Olivia felt the memory rush back before she could stop it. The night sky lit by explosions, the radio screaming with overlapping voices, the smell of burning metal and sand kicked up by helicopters trying to land under fire. She remembered the wounded arriving faster than she could treat them. The moment someone dragged a handler and his dog through the tent while she worked to stop the bleeding. Her hands had been covered in blood that night, moving faster than her thoughts. She remembered shouting orders to men twice her size while the ground shook around them. The veteran's voice pulled her back to the present. There was a handler in that unit, he said quietly. Olivia's chest tightened. He had a K9. Rex lifted his head suddenly, as if the words themselves meant something to him. The veteran leaned forward again, studying Olivia carefully now that the last pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The medic who tried to save him. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Olivia's breath catch in her throat. That was you, wasn't it? For a moment, Olivia couldn't answer him. The diner around them seemed to shrink into a quiet blur, while the past she had buried for years forced its way back to the surface. The sounds of the room faded again. The scrape of chairs, the television murmuring over the counter, the hiss of the grill from the kitchen window. All of it seemed distant compared to the single memory now standing in front of her. Kandahar. The night everything changed. Olivia's eyes drifted down to the floor as Rex pressed closer against her leg, sensing the shift in her breathing. The veteran watched her carefully, but there was no accusation in his expression now, only recognition. You were there, he said quietly, not as a question this time, but as a confirmation of something he had already figured out. Olivia slowly nodded. The motion was small, almost hesitant, but it carried the weight of a confession she had never spoken aloud in years. Angel 6, she repeated softly, as if the call sign belonged to someone else. Her voice trembled just slightly before she steadied it again. That's what they called me. The veteran leaned back against the counter stool, letting out a slow breath as the last pieces of memory settled into place. He remembered hearing that call sign over the radio once during a chaotic evacuation, a medic refusing to abandon wounded operators even while the extraction helicopters were taking fire. It had been the kind of story soldiers repeated quietly afterward, the kind that turned into legend inside units that survived long enough to tell it. But nobody had known what happened to her after that mission. She had simply disappeared from the records. Olivia kept speaking now, the words coming out slowly like they had been waiting years to be released. The handler you mentioned, the one with the K9. I tried to save him. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. We lost too many that night. The veteran didn't interrupt. He simply listened while Rex remained seated beside her, calm and attentive, as if the dog understood more of the story than anyone else in the room. Olivia closed her eyes briefly before continuing. I thought I failed him, she said quietly. I thought if I had moved faster, if I had done something different. Her voice faded before she finished the sentence. She had replayed that moment 1,000 times in her head since leaving the service. The explosion, the blood, the frantic effort to keep a soldier alive while the world around them collapsed into chaos. The veteran shook his head gently. You didn't fail him, he said. Olivia looked up. His voice carried a quiet certainty that cut through the doubt she had carried for years. You stayed when everyone else was pulling back, he continued. You kept working even after the medevac bird was already lifting off. He paused, studying her expression carefully. I know, because I was there. The words landed harder than anything he had said before. Olivia stared at him, trying to process what she had just heard. You were? She asked quietly. The veteran nodded once. Different team, he said. We were providing cover when your unit got hit. His eyes drifted briefly toward Rex before returning to her. That handler you tried to save, he was my friend. The air between them went still again. Olivia felt the familiar weight of guilt rise in her chest. I'm sorry, she whispered. But the veteran's expression didn't change. You shouldn't be, he replied calmly. He didn't die because of you. Olivia frowned slightly, confused by the certainty in his voice. The veteran rested one hand on Rex's harness again before explaining. He died because he pulled 2 wounded operators out of the blast zone before the second explosion hit, he said. You gave him 10 extra minutes, 10 minutes that let the rest of us get those men onto the helicopter. Olivia blinked in surprise, the words hitting her like a sudden shift in gravity. She had never heard that part of the story. After that night, she had left the military almost immediately, convinced the losses had been her responsibility. Rex suddenly stood again. The German shepherd stepped closer to Olivia and gently placed one paw against her arm. The gesture was so soft that it surprised several of the customers watching from nearby booths. The veteran smiled faintly. He remembers the medic tent, he said quietly. Dogs don't forget the people who try to save their handlers. Olivia looked down at the canine, emotion rising in her chest faster than she could control it. She reached out slowly and rested her hand on the dog's head. Rex remained perfectly still, his eyes calm and trusting. For the first time in years, the memory of that terrible night didn't feel like a weight crushing her chest. Instead, it felt like something else entirely. Something closer to closure. The veteran finished the last sip of his coffee before pushing the mug gently aside. Around them, the diner customers had stopped pretending not to listen. Some of the same people who had refused him a seat earlier were now watching the quiet conversation unfold with uneasy expressions. The veteran noticed them too. He shifted slightly on his crutch before standing carefully from the stool. You know, he said calmly, glancing around the room. Most people only see uniforms when they look at veterans. Several heads lowered awkwardly. But sometimes the people who carry the heaviest parts of those stories don't wear uniforms anymore. He nodded toward Olivia. Sometimes they're just working behind a diner counter. The room remained silent. Even the cook in the kitchen window had stopped moving. The veteran turned back to Olivia with a small smile. Thank you for the seat, he said simply. Looks like Rex knew who you were before I did. Olivia laughed softly through the tears she hadn't realized had formed in her eyes. It was the first genuine laugh she had allowed herself in a long time. Rex wagged his tail once before settling back beside the veteran's leg. The moment felt strangely peaceful now, like something unfinished from the past had finally found its ending inside that small roadside diner. As the veteran prepared to leave, he paused near the door and glanced back toward the counter. Angel 6, he said, with quiet respect. Olivia looked up. He gave a small nod. Then he stepped outside with Rex walking proudly beside him. Inside the diner, the silence lingered for several seconds before the normal sound slowly returned. Coffee mugs clinked. Conversations restarted. But something about the atmosphere had changed. The people who had watched the scene unfold were looking at Olivia differently now, not just as a waitress, but as someone who had once stood in the middle of chaos and chosen to help others survive. And sometimes the strongest heroes aren't the ones everyone recognizes. Sometimes they're the ones quietly pouring coffee in a diner, trying to forget the lives they once saved. If stories like this remind you that every person carries a past we may never fully understand, consider subscribing and staying with us for more stories about quiet courage, hidden heroes, and the moments that prove humanity still matters.